All right, so who's getting excited for next year, the 250th birthday of the greatest country in the world? We got a new video out from Ken Burns, the Revolutionary War. He's done a lot of good documentaries. Um, we're diving into it. If you know me, I approach history documentaries with a mix of incitement and a very keen, maybe nitpicky eye to some. Burns has this monumental task that, and in the first episode, um, I was thinking about what he got right and the criticisms we heard some places. Oh, it's gonna be woke. No, well, woke this, woke that, because of Native American mentions, and they some people claiming it's a disservice to the real story of what the Patriots did, and that's not exactly true. Let me start with the context. If we want to truly understand the tension of liberty and slavery, and also maybe Indian relations, the story needs to begin with the precise moment that permanent race-based slavery was legally institutionalized in the colonies. This is where he talks about slavery in the first episode, but doesn't really get into the gritty. This is what I've learned in my life, and was and for decades in this early 17th century, this is 1600s, and the 1700s after that, the reality for many Africans in the 13 colonies was indentured servitude, a form of termed out service, a contractual reality for many Africans and whites. This was a critical distinction from the chattel slavery already enforced in other parts of the British Empire and other European powers, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French. And to put this in perspective, in colonial Virginia, some sources I was reading, half to 2/3 of all immigrants, both European and African, were initially indentured servants. This was the dominant labor system at the time for the British 13 colonies as we know of America today, before the Revolution. A critical detail to note is that when the first English slave ships arrived, you had the White Lion, the Treasurer, arrived in 1619. This is where you get the 1619 project. America wasn't started because of freedom. It was started to institutionalize slavery. It's not. There's a lot of stuff they're leaving out there. The colonies, and many times were initially resistant to adopting brutal permanent chattel system of the Caribbean and other European powers. Africans were acquired and those in those ships and others, but their status could have been treated under the custom of indentured servitude, not necessarily for life. This suggests that the theological sentiments of many faithful Christian colonists was in place to create a strong initial hesitation against the wholesale adoption of permanent racial slavery. This is maybe my editorialization, and I'll be upfront with that, but that's kind of where I understand history from a Christian, from a standpoint, from a historical standpoint. I'm a history buff, amateur historian. I read a lot, and that's all you need to do to understand that you're not learning everything in school. The legal shift to perpetual bondage brings us to the deeply conflicted Massachusetts body of liberties. Some of my first, I haven't actually heard about this one, but new research I was doing pointed me back to it. I might have come across it before. 1641 had an article in there providing the legal basis for slavery with the clause stating, quote, sold to us, unquote, intending to legalize the acquisition of, that seeming to legalize the acquisition of permanent chattel property from the slave trade. That phrase separated permanent status from the contractual, temporary labor model that had dominated of indentured servitude. Those would be 4 to 7 year terms for people. Whites and Africans served. They gained their freedom. Even in some cases, they got a plot of land in some places after their term of service, which was a lot considering how they come from the lowest rungs of society in Europe. They were kind of the untouchables at some points, in some respects. Many of them, if they could, they did that to pay their way on the ship and the transportation and food and lodging until their term was up and they could gain their freedom. Back to the Massachusetts Body of Liberty, 1641. However, many historians argue the document may actually be an anti-slavery measure in disguise due to the internal contradiction that stems from biblical scripture of Capital Law 10, which states, if any man stealeth a man or mankind, he shall surely be put to death. This clause, that's excerpt 21, section 16. This clause, based on the Bible, later echoed by jurists like Blackstone. He was the prominent figure, and I've listened to his works as well, on understanding English common law. The commentaries on the law by Blackstone are highly regarded in Anglo-American jurisprudence. And he defined man stealing as the forcible abduction or stealing away of a man from their own country. It was initially interpreted by the colonists to condemn the worst abuses of the slave trade. This is important. It could condemn the slave trade, this prohibition on man stealing. So the 1641 document presents a profound legal contradiction, a mechanism for slavery in some limited capacity, alongside a capital punishment for the very same act of stealing a person. The legal shift away from equal justice based on servitude status begins with the John Punch case in colonial Virginia, 1640. Punch is another one I had to learn about. A black indentured servant ran away with 2 white European indentured servants, all 3 being captured. The 2 European men had their servitude extended only merely by a few years. John Punch, however, the African indentured, have had his sentence extended and changed to servitude for life. This case is the first documented judicial punishment in Virginia that clearly used race as a determining massive disparity in punishment for the same exact crime, making him a legal precursor to permanent racial slavery that followed. But this is the one here, the next one, where I really, mind blown when I read about this. The system of servitude changed forever. Indentured servitude did in the 1655 Virginia John Cassar case. This case legally cemented the shift to chattel slavery. The person who successfully sued to claim John Cassar as his property for life was Anthony Johnson. He was a black Angolan man who had arrived as an indentured servant decades earlier in the Virginia colony and had since become a free, successful property owner and planter, and also slave owner of other indentured servants, probably white and black. The Cassar case is a chilling irony. A free black man at the time securing the first legal ruling that established lifetime servitude for a person of African descent based on racial distinction. This fundamentally altered the trajectory of American history. And that was because an African man went to court to keep an African man in permanent state of slavery. That's something Burns doesn't tell you. That's something so many people have not told me. I've not learned that in school, public school. And I tell people that story. I don't know if it hits everyone as deep as it really should, but that's the story. Burns, however, this is where he begins. He begins with the immediate conflict surrounding the French and Indian War. His time frame is 1754 to 1763 in the first episode. And so I appreciate his inclusion of the Native American story in the lead up to the Revolution. Burns correctly notes the Native nations like the Iroquois Confederacy and other confederacies making a significant contribution to the economic outlays of our economic activity of colonial commerce. And though most would eventually fight alongside the British, that's largely due to the perceived protection of the 1763 Proclamation or Land Proclamation Act. There were interesting cases of liberty-minded natives adding to the colonial ranks. And they did have a huge impact on the frontiers of American society. The commercial activity that they provided helped the colonists' economy immensely. So they should be included as part of the American story, the Revolution story. I think there is a little bit of a disservice if you're studying American history in schools. They go straight and directly to Columbus and millions of natives dying. A lot of that when 1500s, late 1400s, a lot of that due to disease, not a outwardly program of eradication like we would see in later centuries. We saw the Armenian genocide by the Ottoman Empire. We saw the genocides of the Holodomor and the Nazis and the communist risings around the world, and African genocides, tribal genocides. That stuff didn't exist. Not really. That didn't exist until later. I mean, there was warfare, and warfare may have looked like that, but I don't think the concept was in those people's minds. But they do a disservice on American history to go right to that and then not explain a lot of the relations. The Puritans, for example, had the first and longest lasting peace treaty until like the third generation of their progeny, of their descendants, changed their mindset, and then warfare started. But they came for Thanksgiving. We're thinking about this season right now of Thanksgiving, thanking God for his immeasurable mercies in our lives. But the Puritans, they came here and they almost perished. And even in Virginia, they did this to a lesser extent. They communed with the native peoples and realized the blessings that they had in God protecting and sparing them through harsh weather and winter and travel to get here. Very few survived the first ships in these colonial expeditions, and then they extend the arm of friendship. And sometimes it didn't last that long, sometimes it lasted more, but that just goes to the fallen nature of man. When the first generations, I may have put those legally binding peace agreements with natives, especially the Puritans, they're replaced. Later generations don't always remember, and you see that in the Bible. The Israelites continually offend God, and he continually has to take the chip off their shoulder and work them back into his fold, his flock. And another thing, the presence of sophisticated confederacies amongst the Iroquois, the Cherokee, and other tribes provided the colonists some mild real world right on the periphery of what they could see, experience, and view of elected government and separation of powers. I wouldn't say this influenced their political thinking heavily, but being able to see it up close was pretty important. A lot of the political philosophy for separations of government comes from Anglo-Saxon laws and codes, and English common law, and then Roman and Greek examples of republican government, democratic government. The Dutch Republic at the time was an example. There was some minor republics in Italy, and maybe one or two in Germany, but not many. A lot of authoritarian governments at the time, or unitary governments. The most developed of free government at the time was the Crown of England and his government. Burns does a solid summary of the British constitutional division of powers. He's got the Crown Executive, the House of Lords aristocracy, and the House of Commons to represent the people. He does a good point to note that this established the constitutional precursors to American ideals in many respects. He then establishes the final financial reality. British Isles subjects were paying 26 shillings per year in taxes, while the colonies only paid 1 shilling comparatively. I haven't done the inflation-adjusted maths on that, but that's a huge disparity. But again, the issue was always the legitimacy for the colonists of 13 colonies of the taxing authority. Taxation without representation. They didn't feel they were represented or consulted. The British Parliament didn't go to the colonial assemblies to approve taxes. And that's how they felt they were English. They felt they deserved that right under English law. And here's where you get the lead up to the war. Most history books kind of touch on the taxes thing, and maybe they even mention without representation. But it's not just that. The Crown's subsequent actions designed to impose order and revenue came in a clear wave that the colonists interpreted as tyranny. Number one, the proclamation of 1763 after the French and Indian War. This was the initial source of resentment, barring colonial settlement west of the Appalachians, and appeasing the native populations and nations. a direct denial of land that colonial militias fought the French over that same territory. They thought they might have some sort of stake to build some communities there. The Stamp Act of 1765, this was a seismic event where the first direct tax imposed solely to raise revenue and start paying off Britain's debts. The Crown triggered the famous protests and the formation of the Sons of Liberty, and the fundamental objection here came out: no taxation without representation. And do we see that today? We see that a lot today. Don't look at the bureaucracy, but we see that. The Townshend Acts of 1767, these acts imposed duties on imports like glass, tea, and crucially, the revenue generated was intended to pay the salaries of colonial governors and judges. That is a direct attempt to undermine the power of the purse, separation of powers, and take the colonies themselves, the colonial assemblies, or House of Burgesses if you're Virginia, they paid the royal salaries of governors and judges before the Revolution. This was an act aimed at putting those more in line with the royal authorities, and that was a direct assault on the way of life and legal understanding of freedoms at the time. For in separation of powers. The quartering of troops began. The British posting of troops in Boston presented the constitutional sore point of a standing army in peacetime, the instrument of political oppression typically, and historically that's a standing army. That's how that was viewed. The Tea Act of 1773, not just about tea, but Parliament shifting the remaining payment for colonial judicial officials from local assemblies to the Crown, striking again at the power of the purse. They were again trying to pay colonial officials out of taxes, new taxes raised off these new sections of commodities, and that did not sit right with the colonists. The Quebec Act of 1774 that granted the land in the Ohio Valley all the way to Quebec and granted rights to French Catholics. This offended both the colonists' land claims and their Protestant sensibilities. There was fair tension. You had Maryland was a primary Catholic colony, but they weren't popular all around the 13 colonies, and Protestants did have problems with that. Now, another thing and that's where Burns does a good job. Another thing, the spiritual and constitutional omissions that Burns leaves out, and many historians of modern times leave out. Let's talk about what I felt was missing of these omissions. In the first episode, for me, simply doesn't start where the story truly began. The revolution didn't start politically necessarily, but spiritually in the hearts of men. The fires were lit in the First Great Awakening from the 1730s to the 1740s. This was a spiritual revolution that taught people to challenge established authority and value their individual conscience over rigid hierarchy, priestcraft, the Anglican priestcraft, and embrace egalitarian ideas more broadly amongst the congregations, denominations at that time. This was the moral fire that underlit the natural rights arguments. They stem from biblical values, Christian and Judeo values, but primarily Christian. Alongside the spiritual fervor there were profound religious threats. Burns could have amplified the episcopacy controversy. That fear with that wasn't just about a bishop, but the increasing presence of the Church of England's association, or they call it, there's a society a little bit separate, but of the same denomination of the Anglican Church of England, the Society for the Promulgation of the Gospel, the Society for Sharing the Gospel. But this was an association of the colonists that they believed was actively working to subvert local self-governing churches and impose London's centralized Anglican control. I read about this in some of the early historical collections about the faith of the founders. And one of the preachers was a pulpit of the American Revolution. One of the preachers brought that up. That's the first time I saw it. And for the religious folks, that really does make sense. You had the Church of England and their friends in the society asking the crown to reestablish Anglican Church of England priests in the colonial parishes, and they had, whenever they would lose a priest or pastor, the Anglican Church would then say, well, you guys can't choose your own. They wanted to have the church in England choose someone who was friendly to the doctrines that served the crown and served the society. That was a subversion more problematic that can be imagined to some. This reinforced the image of an overreaching and oppressive power. The unity of church and state in the British government as well was a really bad problem, how that was seen. And what about the militia? Burns doesn't get into this, and many modern historians and documentaries don't get into this. The British legal history has something called the Assize of Arms, coming from 1181, a legally mandated statute that free men and free citizens, free civilians, possess specific arms to defend the realm. The militia was the constitutional embodiment of a free people. The goal of a well-regulated militia, as we would hear later on in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, was simply to ensure that the people themselves were properly equipped and trained. It was a duty and a right. The deployment of a standing army in Boston was the ultimate constitutional violation, and English history bears out a lot of tension between standing armies and the people, the militia. And whenever a standing army came and started, it would enforce new taxes and oppress the people. It's generally problematic in history. Excuse me. Now, one truly surprising, commendable inclusion, and then I'm just going to say one more thing about the militia. We need to understand that is an important thing. The militia was the Minutemen, the militia that met outside of Boston, Lexington, and Concord. They were raised in this mindset. Well, your community, your local town council, your local county or township, or even church, will gather funds and buy a cannon or buy arms and powder to store in your town government buildings or storage someplace, and they would use that in times of defense, because the colonists themselves didn't have standing armies, they would have professional soldiers in the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War, and then they'd put out the continental soldiers in the Revolution. But England and the large powers of Europe of the day were the only ones to have consistent, regular forces. The Redcoats, the French, you name it. So this was just something they lived and breathed. And it was decades, centuries old. Even the Romans and Greeks have some indications of arming the people, have a right to be armed with a basic standard, in this case, in the essays of arms. Now, one truly surprising, commendable inclusion by Burns was the mention of the Continental Association of 1774. This is something that I don't think I even heard about. Burns does note that the colonies, as early as December 1st, 1774, or in 1774, there was a proposal to limit the English slave trade in that moment of time. To be absolutely clear on the significance of that, the delegates proposed in 74 a complete intercolonial ban on the transatlantic slave trade, and this was passed and adopted by the First Continental Congress. It is codified in Article 2 of the Continental Association. This is huge. It was powerful, unified, binding policy. The first time all colonies agreed to enforce an end to the Atlantic slave trade. This was, granted, this was a kind of economic shot across the bow, a final warning before independence would be announced in a couple years later in 1776. They wanted to restrict trade and do a boycott of England. They thought this would move the British Crown to really seriously consider their arguments and bring them back to the table. That this proves out that the early revolutionary patriots were not fully convinced of the efficacy or morality of the institution of slavery, and they were willing to outlaw its engine of the slave trade. When united for liberty, they were willing to eliminate the slave trade, even if it were to be temporary. There was a huge religious undergirdment and ethical conception of freedom that really did stick out in the patriot cause, and you see that there. Although that didn't end slavery, and it wasn't ended for many years after. That's just incredible. I'm surprised he put that in there. How many of our so-called experts leave this stuff out and just to dilute us. The ban was a potent economic weapon against Britain, but it also reflects the moral sentiment of the time, and I commend Burns for bringing that to light. So that's not woke at all. That's actually anti-woke. I love seeing the inclusion of voices like Mercy Otis Warren, the great satirist, Crispus Attucks, the first casualty of the Boston Massacre, killed 5 people. They called it a massacre. And let's look closer, and we got to get a little bit of a look at Phyllis Wheatley. Burns mentions and includes her, but we can look closer because her story is deeper. She published the first English-language book by a person of African origin, proving her profound independent value as a human being. Even amidst the slavery she endured, her deep, profound faith was evident, and she wrote that book while enslaved. still. She not only prayed for her masters, but simultaneously embodied the intellectual capacity that defined the very institution that held her captive. Really, really good writer, and was widely upheld by people like Washington, Jefferson, the New Englanders as well. Burns mentions the anti-slavery thoughts of Benjamin Rush, Dr. Rush, and the Adams family, not the double D Adams, the real one, the one with the fake beer named after him. But he needed to connect that to the agonizing fight in the South. That was also an anti-slavery movement. Governor Thomas Jefferson himself had a measure to end the Virginia importation of the slave trade during the war, which was passed. But and later his vision to ban slavery expansion into the new territories through the Ordinance of 1784. This was also a huge push, the land ordinance of 1784 after the Revolution. It was abolitions pushed this, but it failed nationally by the narrowest margin. One state vote, that single failure largely due to the power of South Carolina and Georgia, and the failure of New Jersey, I think, to make their delegates show up to that vote. So if New Jersey was present, and even South Dakota had abolitionist representatives at various points, Georgia was the strongest against the anti-slavery measures. But and then you had a little bit more support in the Carolinas, some support for slavery in Maryland and Virginia. But I'd argue Virginia may have been almost 55-60% anti-slavery abolitionists. If you dig into the significant leaders from Virginia, political leaders, you'll probably see something like that. That allowed slavery to be cemented in the American structure until the Civil War. So my concluding thoughts, the first episode of Ken Burns' American Revolution. Is it woke? No. It's beautifully produced, but it misses the spiritual ferment of the Great Awakening. It understates the profound constitutional fear of the standing army and the importance and legal standing of the militia and the people, and the bearing of arms were not being restricted to any type of arms, but were kept as a mere standard, a simple standard for their defense. And he also understates the sense of liberty when it comes to the episcopacy controversy, and only scratches the surface of the agonizing anti-slavery struggle that almost succeeded by the Revolutionary War's political leaders themselves. They almost succeeded. What do you think? Did you notice these things? Did other aspects stand out to you? Let me know in any comments you have, and stay tuned. I'll probably come back with the thoughts on the next episodes, but probably shorter. I'll try to make it shorter. 40 minutes is a little long, but here you go.